wait is finally over. God of War Ragnarok is finally here. And I will say right off the bat, if you think this game looks less brutal than the previous games, it's not the game. I've had some issues recently with my God of War videos being marked for adult content, so I have to be more careful with the shots that I'm choosing. So, a bit of history. When I first saw the announcement for God of War 2018, or as I've come to call it, Dad of Boy, I was confused and a bit nonplussed. I was a little bit put off by how different it was compared to the original 6 games, and by all accounts, I felt like it was trying to be the video game equivalent of Oscar bait, because wanting to make something that would be good enough to win awards was apparently a bad thing to me in 2016 through to 2020. I mean, it totally is the video game equivalent of Oscar bait, but that's not a bad thing. I had the slightly immature attitude of it's different and therefore ruined at the time without actually experiencing the media for myself or being able to articulate anything about why it's different and therefore ruined other than it being different. Then in 2020, I rediscovered my dormant love for the God of War series as I hadn't played it in a good 6 years at that point, and those games quickly reminded me of why I loved this series so much as a teenager, and it has since become my favorite video game franchise overall. Following which I actually played Dad of Boy, and my narrow-minded viewpoint changed with first-hand experience. While I probably should have learned this lesson much sooner, it's kind of the game that taught me not to prejudge. As a matter of fact, just as a side tangent, if you are the type of person who just takes people's word for it, or repeats other people's opinions as if they are fact, just don't. If what I say here today makes you interested in the game, play it for yourself so you can come to your own first-hand conclusion. Don't just regurgitate what I have to say. For me, God of War 2018 was a great game that I thoroughly enjoyed when I finally got around to playing it, despite being entirely incomparable to the games that preceded it. It's definitely not for everyone, and I could definitely see it as too steep a departure from the previous games, but in hindsight, I felt that after 6 games, the series needed a good shake-up if it hoped to continue. So I found myself suddenly excited for the at-the-time unnamed sequel to God of War 2018. I say this to give you context as to where I stand with the series, so you can hopefully get some context for why I'm saying what I'm saying and why I think the way I think. But I'm not gonna lie, I wasn't quite married to the idea of doing a straight-up review of God of War Ragnarok because I'm not really married to the idea of doing reviews in general. Pretentious as this may sound, I don't really like to discuss games so much as I like to discuss larger ideas surrounding games. But since you guys have shown me so much support over the past several months, I would be remiss not to do so. But make no mistake, just as this won't be the last God of War game, this sure as hell is not going to be the last time I talk about God of War Ragnarok. I'm gonna try and keep this as spoiler-free as possible, but I will say I did kind of make up a mental checklist of things I expected to see. For example, between the trailers making Atreus seem somewhat belligerent, as well as the tease of the similarly aged female character, that made me wonder if there was going to be a subplot with Atreus flying the coop, so to speak. I had it in my mind for a while that Atreus was supposed to be 15 in this game, however that's apparently false. Multiple sources have confirmed he's actually 14, which I actually think is a missed opportunity, because if they were going to do a subplot about him striking out on his own, him being 15 would have been thematically synchronous. What with Kratos being Spartan? Because apparently, but don't quote me on this, male Spartans were considered to be men when they turned 15. But I've caught myself rambling again. Other things I was keenly interested in was the role that Tyr was going to play in the story, if he was going to try and prevent Ragnarok, or if they were going to subvert the trailers. I was also interested to find out if Kratos was going to properly die like he has before, by which I mean if he was going to crawl out of Helheim much in the same way that he crawled out of Hades multiple times. I also wondered what role, if any, that Athena was going to play into this, what with her ghost haunting Kratos in the previous game. Then I was wondering which gods were going to die and which gods were going to be spared. I was pretty sure Freya and Thor were probably going to meet an unhappy ending because that was already teased in the previous game. Then there's the matter of which gods were going to make an appearance. When it comes to adaptations of Norse mythology, you're always hearing about Thor, Odin, Loki, and Balder, but I was genuinely curious to see who else was going to make an appearance. It's funny, I was never that familiar with Norse mythology outside of the big names, but recently I binged my way through the Magnus Chase trilogy, which incidentally I think is the most well-constructed series of books that Rick Riordan's ever written, with Alex Fierro potentially being my favorite character he's ever written, so I was excited to see how many of the same names and places would come up. Here's the thing though, I could make all the mental checklists and all the predictions in the world, but I was fully aware that this game was going to surprise me because I'm no professional screenwriter, but I could definitely predict that the last thing they wanted God of War Ragnarok to be was predictable. I don't want to spoil how many of my predictions came true, but yes, this game did indeed surprise me. Of course, based on the name of the game, you can get the impression that Ragnarok is the primary through line for the game, attempting to prevent Ragnarok and questioning whether it's even possible to prevent Ragnarok, or if we're just merely slaves to destiny. Of course, since it's called Ragnarok, and because of the Chekhov's gun principle, you know that this isn't something they're gonna tease and not go through with. So their efforts will ultimately fail, but it's the ride that counts, and there's a lot more to the story than simply preventing something from happening. The first thing worth mentioning is that the first hour and a half to 2 hours of this game might actually be my favorite video game intro of all time. It's balls to the wall with just big moment after big moment after big moment. And there are several sequences, one of which has already made the rounds, which are genuine jaw-droppers. I would say from the moment you boot up the game until you get to Brock and Sindri's house is absolute brilliance, but the game can't maintain that momentum as it settles into its groove. Which is fine, because I don't think any story could ever maintain that kind of momentum throughout its entire runtime, and I was genuinely willing to go with the game on whatever it threw at me, simply because the intro was that good. But it does take a while. The pacing is a bit weird in this game overall. There are times when you're headlong in the action and there's a lot of story happening to complement said action, but then there are a few sections that slow the pace right down. Either by being overlong, generally slow, or both. The 2.5 hour section in the Ironwood springs to mind. That was a point where the game really started to lose me. Not helped by a companion character who I found to be grating after a while due to being awkward in a way that I found annoying rather than endearing. Said companion character eventually won me over by the end of that section, but it was a rough start. That said, this game had a habit of losing me and then pulling me right back in. Like, the section immediately after the Ironwood is one of my favorites in the game. It's after the gameplay kicks into high gear, so it's fun in that respect, and then it's a very compelling part of the story as it's tying up one of the major plot threads. But more importantly, it's a sequence that is extremely rewarding to longtime players. Kratos discusses past events with his support character. They discuss Kratos' history, his family, all his misdeeds, and they even bring up Deimos. I can't remember the last time they brought him up. It may seem like pandering, but these discussions of Kratos' past are extremely relevant to the plot going on in that specific moment. So it's rewarding, but it's also well integrated. It's not like Family Guy where Peter will just randomly say, "Hey Lois, this is worse than that time I joined the KKK." So the story definitely has its peaks and troughs, but if you can handle the slow bits, there's a lot of good here as they're tying up the Norse saga. Damn, that's hard to say. There's a lot to get through, but the worst of it is definitely in the first third or so, and the back half of the game is just satisfying payoff after satisfying payoff. From the previous game, this game, and the series as a whole. And that's not to say that any of these chunks of the game are necessarily bad, but once you get through the lesser bits, your patience pays off with a lot, and I mean a lot, of good stuff. In particular, I love what they did with Kratos' character. I can't really describe why that's the case without getting into spoilers, unfortunately, but his character development and overall arc in the story is so emotionally satisfying to watch. Some people have taken issue with how jokey this game can be at times, but I don't mind so much because the serious characters remain serious, whereas you just have some characters who appear who are either incidentally funny, or characters that have a sense of humor. This game maintains a relatively serious tone while also having a fair bit of levity. It's not like Kratos and Freya are quipping at each other while they're fighting. And that's not a spoiler, that scene happens in the trailer. I don't necessarily mind games that are serious or funny so long as you succeed at what you set out to do. I don't mind a story being serious so long as it succeeds at being serious, nor do I mind a story that has a sense of humor so long as the humor works and doesn't interfere with the serious elements, that is to say if there are any serious elements to speak of. With that said, it's not lost on me just how jarring it continues to be that these games are ostensibly in the same series as this. It especially comes across in the dialogue. Kratos still has a level of dignity and poetry in his speech cadence, but he's also surrounded by a bunch of characters who have very crude dialogue in a very 21st century way, and it's a clash of styles that makes this game surreal at times. I was playing the game, and I had a moment of utter disbelief that this game and this game are part of the same series. It wasn't even anything about that particular moment, it was just a realization right at this point. But once you're able to suspend that particular instinct, you'll probably enjoy what's here. I certainly did. It's probably the most invested I've been in a story for a hot minute, and it's genuinely one of the most emotionally gratifying stories I've ever felt. There are so many feels. There were like 5 separate instances in the game where I found myself welling up, but I'm not gonna lie, there was one moment where I genuinely found myself crying. You know how the last game has an ending and then it kind of has a second ending where you see the true credits? Well, this game has a similar credit sequence. I only cried for a moment though, I'm not that much of a pansy. This might be entirely unique to me because I love this series. I can't say how much a new player would get out of this, but it truly was the most feelsy game I think I've ever played. Now, I probably can't talk about the story much more than that without going into specifics, so I'll drop that and touch on the gameplay. The combat as a whole I feel has been really improved, something that isn't immediately apparent because you'll probably just default back to the same combos you used in the previous game. But as you get deeper into the game, you'll start to notice all the tweaks they made. Rather than give you a ton of new weapons, they fundamentally expand on the existing gameplay. The previous game had a combat engine that felt great, but didn't have the most variety, relying on things like magical abilities to extend your arsenal. The worst thing that a new addition to the combat can be is an interruption to the combat rather than an addition, whereas here there's a fair amount of combat additions and alterations that can be seamlessly integrated into your combos and arsenal of moves without ever missing a step. Which I think is the absolute best way to go, and there's nothing more satisfying to me than doing a wind-up spin, knocking them into the air, and juggling them. I think in the entire hack-and-slash genre, juggling is a universal id tickler that I never get tired of. Elsewise than that, the combat feels more refined than last time. It was by no means clunky before, but it flows smooth as butter here. It's hard to pin down any one specific improvement, it just feels like they've done a lot of tweaking and refining to really nail the feel of combat. Though in hindsight, and this goes for the first Dad of Boy as well, I guess it's kind of disappointing that without any sort of combo counter or bonus for extended combos without getting hit, there's no incentive to go combo mad beyond your own enjoyment. Which isn't necessarily a bad thing. Doing things for the sake of enjoyment is kind of the point of video games, but I do kind of wish the game rewarded you for playing like a based gamer god and killing entire swarms of baddies without once getting hit. You have various stats and contextual buffs that will activate depending on certain things happening in combat, which are also dependent on which items you have equipped, but those don't usually affect combat too much. Is it too much to ask for a little bit of bonus experience depending on my performance during combat? Though sometimes getting a full combo can be a bit hit and miss, no pun intended, because of various interruptions. I did find long-ranged enemies to be a bit more of a pain in the ass than before, which I think is to emphasize the grapple attacks and long-ranged attacks. Also, the trade-off for emphasizing natural combat additions means that the runic attacks do take a bit of a backseat. I was well over halfway through the game before I even got my first heavy runic attack for the Blades of Chaos, and it was in a side mission. But either way, I did find the combat by and large to be a significant step up from the previous game, offering much cleaner combos and many more attacks that seamlessly go together. The puzzles on the other hand, well, the CPU had a habit of being a little bit too helpful. By default, if you take too long on certain puzzles, one of your side characters will just solve the puzzle for you. You can disable this, but it won't disable their tendency to yell out hints at you, which actually led to one of the most unintentionally hilarious moments in the game for me. I solved a deflection puzzle at the exact moment Atreus was giving me a hint, and the timing somehow activated a glitch where Atreus would then repeat his scripted hint roughly every 30 seconds for something like the next half hour.
There's a gap in the fence over there. There's a gap in the fence over there.
How's that look, Atreus?
We came in from the top last time. Didn't realize all this was even. There's a gap in the fence over there.
The puzzle design is generally a step up from the previous game, giving you some real head scratchers that also include various additional abilities from your support characters, which is probably why they have the slightly overly helpful hint/auto-solve systems they do. But it would be nice if it was not activated by default, and maybe they have a hint pop up on screen if you get stuck. Either to let you know that they have the option of auto-solving puzzles, or maybe a character says that they figured it out and you have to press a button to let them solve it, or have Kratos shut them down. The deflection puzzles were especially fun because I enjoy puzzles based around one zone perspective, and it's really interesting to me how most of the aspects of gameplay introduced specifically for puzzles are also integrated into the combat. The different runic arrows are an obvious one, but even the aforementioned deflection puzzle can be used in combat, wherein if you deflect your axe into one of the elves, the axe will be infused with light magic which will heavily damage one of the elves, bringing them down to critical health. A little bit overpowered, but I am playing this on medium. That plays into another aspect I appreciate about the game, wherein God of War Ragnarok will usually have something to subtly differentiate gameplay in each area of the game. Sometimes though it's not so subtle, hence the Atreus sections. Now that was a segue if I ever heard one. Unlike last time, we're not solely playing as Kratos. I don't think it's a spoiler to say that you do occasionally take control of Atreus, and much in the same way that Atreus is an NPC assist to Kratos, Atreus has his own NPC assists. I feel like, to tell the story they wanted to, they kind of needed to make him a playable character because this is a game. You need gameplay. You couldn't tell a story from his perspective without giving him playable character status because these are some pretty extended story sequences. His combat doesn't quite have the same versatility that Kratos' does, meaning these sequences are good in short bursts, but when they get too long, they can be pretty tedious. That section I mentioned earlier in the Ironwood that goes on for too long, and the game started to lose me? Yeah, that's an Atreus section. Although he's tending to prefer his other name. If you know, you know. The story aspects of his sections do get more compelling later on, but I don't think his gameplay ever evolves meaningfully enough to where it becomes fun for long stretches. Now, to scooch back over to Kratos' gameplay, spending a good chunk of the game with only the same 2 weapons you had in the previous game is a little bit disappointing, and I thought they weren't going to introduce any more weapons. And the game gave me no reason to think otherwise, considering how long it took them to finally introduce the 3rd major weapon, the Drop-Near Spear. But I'm glad they eventually gave us more. Better late than never. It's a new addition that fits naturally into the combat and puzzles. It's usually not the most complex, falling back to just finding the right spot, but the combat really makes it worth it, as it's a spear that infinitely clones itself, making for some really interesting combat mechanics, different enough from the other 2 weapons to feel distinct, while also being useful enough to not come across as gimmicky. It fits into your arsenal perfectly, plus it plays into possibly my favorite boss fight in the entire game. Not for any reasons necessarily pertaining to the gameplay, although it was good on that front, but more so for the reason of, I really wanted to kill that son of a bitch. Otherwise, graphically, I think this game is absolutely stunning. Some of these environments truly took my breath away to the point that I just stopped and stared for a while. But this is also my first true PS5 game, and I don't actually find that it looks noticeably better than a bunch of PS4 games I've played. For example, I played The Last of Us 2 recently, and fidelity-wise, that game doesn't really look all that worse than Ragnarok. I think we've reached the point where graphical fidelity basically has no limit, and it's simply down to the skill of the developers to bring the most out of their games. Granted, I said that back when Infamous 2 came out, and that game looks noticeably dated now, so I guess we'll just have to wait another 10 years to see how things look on the PS7. Which is infinitely more awkward to say than PS5, but that does come with the caveat that I was playing this in performance mode, which is something more common to games these days that I really appreciate because I value frame rate over graphical fidelity. If there's one thing I can compliment this game for performance-wise, it's the loading times. I'd heard that the SSDs of modern systems were game changers, and there is no lie detected. The loading times were almost instantaneous. SSDs truly are the way of the future. And another thing, I am absolutely flabbergasted by how much detail this game has. And I don't necessarily mean in the world or environments, but that's certainly true. I'm talking about how the characters interact. They have a contextual dialogue line for near enough everything in the game. If you decide to go on a side path to find treasure, somebody will say something.
Is everything okay?
Aye, old friend. Just looting on your chests. We'll be right along.
It will have several unique lines to that effect. Then, if you reach a dead end while climbing, they'll say as much.
Brother, we've taken a wrong turn. Our thief's gone skyward.
Then, whether you decide to pursue a side mission or go back to the main hub after an area's main mission is done, there will be a contextual line to explain why you're doing one or the other.
We are not ignoring it. We will discuss it back home. For now, I wish to search for the wounded animal you heard earlier.
You? Really?
Yes.
Ah, we can always try finding Helka some other time.
The only time I remember this being a thing in the previous game was if you backtracked a little too far, Atreus would quip about how we could come back later. I know it's a relatively small thing, but to me, it just paints this picture of how painstakingly difficult this game must have been to make. It truly does feel like one of the most detailed games I've ever played, and one that deserves to have taken 4 years to have made. Mentioning no other games that came out around the same time, although other people have certainly decided to make it their personality to compare the two, and you people are the reason I'm even bringing this up. And of course beyond that, you have the dozens upon dozens of unique conversations you can have between characters throughout the game. That was also present in the previous game, but Ragnarok is continuing that theme, and it's appreciated nonetheless. Now, if I were to bring up 2 different nitpicks that I found while playing this game, they are thus. First of all, the subtitles are way too far up the screen. I think it's because the ambient noises are supposed to go below them, but I didn't have the ambient noises subtitles on. I find the subtitles to be distractingly high up on the screen, and I would really like it if I was given the option to move them lower down. Then the menus are very confusing. You have sub-menus upon sub-menus. You have separate upgrade trees for magic spells and the different combat abilities. There are several different buttons you have to hit at any given moment depending on what part of the menu you're in. It takes a while to get used to, and there certainly should have been ways to make it better. For example, there are different abilities that can be upgraded using EXP but are in different menus, and the interface is built in such a way that it's not even immediately obvious that you can upgrade some of them. But those are my two most immediately major nitpicks that came up. And this isn't necessarily a nitpick, just a personal thing. I don't think it's necessarily a spoiler to say that there is a final battle to this game, but it really felt like the perfect opportunity to play The End Begins, but they didn't, and it would have made the moment so much more epic, just to play it one more time. Otherwise than that, I can't really think of any specific thing that I took major issue with. As a matter of fact, I can't really think of many issues I took with this game at all. Anything major I didn't like was later justified in such a way that made me retroactively more positive about it, and all my other issues, whether an improvement but not enough of an improvement or a detriment compared to the previous game, weren't big enough deals to make me really get mad. I really wish I could spoil what the hell I'm talking about, but I digress. The big question that hangs over this game from the outset is thus: was the wait worth it? Well, I think the answer is absolutely. God of War Ragnarok is one of the few instances of a game absolutely living up to the hype. It has its slow moments and definitely has its weaker aspects, but if you were into God of War 2018, this is a definitive improvement, and you owe it to yourself to see the conclusion of this particular duology. That said, there is another question that hangs over this game. If you didn't like God of War 2018, Dad of Boy if you will, is Ragnarok the game that will sell you on these games? Well, I think it's definitely an improvement, but I honestly don't think I'm prepared to say that it will sell you on the new games if you already didn't like them. I've had conversations with other content creators and trusted colleagues, and one in particular told me that he didn't really like Dad of Boy, and Dad of Boy Rabadoo was roughly on the same level in that it improves in some ways but is also worse in other ways, which I think mirrors my opinion quite well as a matter of fact. I just happen to be in a position where I'm more positive on it overall, but there are definitive improvements, and I'm not sure how much the improvements will affect the individual experience, especially when weighed against the issues that cropped up. To me, it's definitely a game that starts off good and gets amazing later as the full scope of the mechanics and story are introduced, but if you're not digging it at first, there's no guarantee that you'll get to the point where the game becomes acceptably good to you. Especially when taking into consideration that this is not an 8 to 10 hour linear experience. No, God of War Ragnarok is a commitment. I wasn't even sure if I was going to have enough time to finish the game in time to make the video. Just pursuing the main path is roughly a full 24 hours on its own, with an additional 20 to 25 hours of side content, most of which is also very story relevant and will continue to build the characters' relationships and personalities, as opposed to a lot of games where the side missions are just collect the thing. So it's not like you don't have an incentive to play the side content. In fact, the game sometimes makes you feel bad for not doing them. Here's what I think. If you enjoyed the last game, then you'll love this game. If your main hang-up with the previous game was the combat, then you'll probably enjoy this. If you didn't enjoy the previous game, but enjoy Kratos as a character, then you'll like this game because it has a lot of introspective examination in how the past has shaped Kratos into who he is. But if you genuinely just didn't like the previous game, and I understand if you didn't, I can't say that Ragnarok will be for you. And hey, nobody is wrong for simply not liking a thing. That's something I've learned in my life, is that if something's popular, it's probably for a good reason, even if I don't personally agree. But it's also perfectly valid to just simply not like a thing. And those are my slightly abbreviated thoughts on God of War Ragnarok. Now, trust me, there are large chunks of the game that I'm just dying to tell you about, but I want to keep this as minimal as possible. So I definitely recommend this game, but then again, I am also a giant God of War shill. Unashamedly, because if enjoying things I genuinely enjoy is a bad thing, I'll wear that scarlet S on my chest with pride. People are allowed to enjoy the things they enjoy, and people are allowed to not enjoy the things they don't. It's those who mock the other side who can suck on a salty sausage. If you liked this video and want to support the channel, please consider pledging to my Patreon for unique perks and benefits like these fine folks right here. Then a special thank you to users Inutsu, Pharmacat84, GAW004, and Raaf for going above and beyond. And if you want to support the channel for free, please consider liking this video, subscribing, leaving me a comment telling me what you think, and hitting the notification icon so you're always up to date on what I'm doing. Otherwise than that, I've been the King of Snark Style right here on Tactical Bacon Productions, and I will see you next time. Peace!